Heartless Tycoon treated his maid as just a servant until he fell in love and married her. The Sinclair estate was a palace of wealth, but its halls echoed with an unsettling emptiness. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, reflecting golden light across the grand marble floors. Towering windows framed the sprawling gardens, where roses bloomed in perfect symmetry, perfection, a rule that Lancaster Sinclair demanded in every aspect of his life. Lancaster, the ruthless billionaire, sat in his office, tapping his pen against a sleek mahogany desk. His sharp gray eyes skimmed over contracts worth millions, but not a single flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Deals were won, empires expanded, yet nothing ever felt enough. Amelia Hart moved swiftly through the corridors, adjusting the pristine white gloves on her hands. Unlike the extravagant surroundings, Amelia was a woman of simplicity. Her days were spent ensuring the mansion ran flawlessly, her nights devoted to her younger brother, Samuel, who was the only family she had left. To Lancaster, Amelia was just another staff member, a fixture in his world, no different from the polished floors or the imported paintings. But that was about to change. It happened one morning. Amelia carefully arranged the breakfast table in the grand dining hall, ensuring everything was immaculate, just as Mr. Sinclair demanded. The silverware gleamed, the eggs were cooked precisely to his preference, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. Lancaster entered, dressed in his tailored black suit, his presence commanding yet cold. He sat down without a word, reaching for his coffee. The moment the cup touched his lips, his expression darkened. "Cold," he muttered. Amelia blinked. That wasn't possible. She had just poured it. "Sir, Lancaster pushed the cup aside with a scowl. "Do I pay you to argue?" His tone was sharp, dismissive. "Get me another one." Amelia felt heat rise to her cheeks. She had served in this house for years, enduring his indifference, his impossible standards. But something in her snapped. "With all due respect, Mr. Sinclair," she said, standing firm, "the coffee isn't cold. But if you'd like another one, I'll gladly get it." For the first time, Lancaster truly looked at her. His gray eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something unreadable, something dangerously close to intrigue. A maid who dared to challenge him? Amelia turned on her heel and walked away, unaware that she had just become the only person who had ever defied Lancaster Sinclair. And for the first time in his life, the Heartless Tycoon felt something he couldn't control. The next few days were different. Amelia noticed the change before she could even understand it. Lancaster Sinclair, the man who barely spared her a glance, was now watching her. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but she could feel it. His sharp gray eyes followed her movements as she set the table, adjusted the curtains, and gave quiet instructions to the other staff. At first, she ignored it. Men like Lancaster Sinclair didn't concern themselves with people like her. Yet, his actions spoke otherwise. One evening, as Amelia was wiping down the library shelves, she heard voices, Lancaster and his longtime friend, Brandon Sinclair. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Brandon said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You've already built an empire. Maybe it's time you enjoyed it." "I don't have time for distractions," Lancaster replied coolly. Brandon chuckled. "Not even for that feisty maid of yours?" Amelia froze. A pause. "She's just a maid, Brandon." Lancaster's voice was emotionless. Amelia's fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands. "That's what I thought. Though, I have to admit, she's easy on the eyes. If you ever get bored, you could." The sound of glass slamming against the table cut Brandon off. "Careful," Lancaster said, his voice dangerously low. Amelia didn't wait to hear more. She turned and left, her heart pounding. That night, for the first time since she started working at the estate, she questioned whether she could stay. But fate had other plans. A week later, Amelia received a call that turned her world upside down. Samuel had collapsed. Her younger brother, her entire reason for enduring the long hours, the cold treatment, was in the hospital. And the medical bills were overwhelming. Amelia sat in the break room, clutching the invoice in her hands, her vision blurring with tears. She had no savings. No one to turn to. The next morning, she made a decision. She would have to beg Lancaster Sinclair for an advance. But before she could gather the courage, something unexpected happened. Her phone buzzed. A notification from the hospital. Payment received. Amelia's breath caught. Confused, she rushed to the front desk, asking who had paid. The nurse looked at her and smiled. Anonymous donor. But, she lowered her voice, the hospital director mentioned something about the Sinclair estate. Amelia's world tilted. Lancaster. The same man who barely acknowledged her. The same man who had called her just a maid. Her heart pounded. Why would he do this? And more importantly, what did it mean? Amelia was restless. For days, she tried to convince herself that Lancaster's act of kindness meant nothing. Maybe it was just guilt. Maybe he did it out of obligation. Rich men like him could throw money around without a second thought. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. And soon, Lancaster's behavior confirmed her suspicions. It started with small things. Lancaster, who once never acknowledged her presence, suddenly spoke to her. Not in orders. Not in dismissals. In questions. How is your brother? He asked one morning, his voice unusually gentle. Amelia, who had been clearing his breakfast tray, nearly dropped the silverware. She blinked at him, trying to find the sarcasm in his voice, but there was none. He's recovering, she finally answered, cautiously. Lancaster only nodded and returned to his coffee, but the moment lingered in Amelia's mind far longer than it should have. Then there were the stolen glances. She caught them when she dusted the library shelves, when she set the dining table, when she passed him in the hallways. Lancaster Sinclair was watching her. And for the first time, she didn't feel like just a maid. One evening, Amelia stayed back later than usual to organize the books in the estate's grand library. She had always loved this room, the scent of old pages, the warm glow of the chandelier, the quiet. But she wasn't alone. Lancaster stood by the fireplace, nursing a drink, his gaze lost in the flickering flames. You work too much, he said without turning around. Amelia hesitated. I have responsibilities. His lips curved slightly, but there was something distant in his eyes. Don't we all? A moment of silence stretched between them. You always ask about my brother, Amelia said cautiously. Why? Lancaster took a sip of his whiskey, exhaled. Because I know what it's like to be responsible for someone you love. His words hung heavy in the air. Amelia frowned, watching his profile. There was something about the way he said it, like there was a story buried beneath. Did someone help you? She asked, her voice softer. Lancaster's jaw tightened. No, he said simply. Amelia studied him for a moment. For the first time, Lancaster Sinclair didn't seem untouchable. And that terrified her. But just as things began to shift between them, the outside world reminded Amelia of her place. Brandon Sinclair had always been an arrogant man. But today, he was particularly insufferable. So, Amelia, he smirked as she poured wine into his glass during a business dinner, how does it feel working here? Being surrounded by all this wealth, knowing you'll never have it? Amelia's grip on the bottle tightened. I don't think about it, she said calmly. Brandon chuckled. Oh, come on. You must have thought about it. About Lancaster. His voice dropped, taunting. A rich man. A poor maid. Classic fairy tale, don't you think? Amelia's face burned with humiliation. The room fell silent. Lancaster, who had been sitting across the table, set down his fork. Brandon, his voice was low, dangerous. But Amelia had already had enough. She set the bottle down with a steady hand, turned to Brandon, and smiled, polite, but sharp. You're mistaken, Mr. Sinclair. I don't dream of fairy tales. She straightened, meeting his gaze fearlessly. I create my future. Brandon's smirk faltered. But Lancaster was looking at her differently. Like he had never truly seen her before. The confrontation left a mark. Amelia could feel the whispers in the hallways, the judgment from Lancaster's wealthy associates. But what hurt the most was Lancaster's silence. For days, he said nothing. No apology. No reassurance. Just silence. And that was all the answer Amelia needed. She couldn't stay. So one morning, she packed her things. You're leaving? The housekeeper, Mrs. Graham, looked at her with concern. Amelia forced a smile. I think it's time. But before she could step out of the estate for good, a voice stopped her. Amelia. She turned. Lancaster stood at the top of the grand staircase, his expression unreadable. Amelia swallowed the lump in her throat. You don't have to go, he said. Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag. Yes, Lancaster, she whispered. I do. Then, before he could say another word, she walked away. Leaving behind not just the estate, but the man who had begun to mean far too much. Amelia had never felt so lost. For years, she had worked tirelessly to provide for her brother, Samuel, to secure a future that didn't involve scrubbing marble floors and serving champagne to people who barely saw her. Now, as she settled into her small rented room above a modest cafe in the city, she realized this was her fresh start. But why did it feel like she had left something behind? Or someone? Lancaster Sinclair was drowning. In silence. In regret. In something he didn't want to name. The mansion felt empty without her. The mornings were quieter without the soft hum of her voice in the kitchen. The library felt abandoned without the sound of her careful hands dusting the shelves. Even his meals tasted different, like they were missing something essential. And that was when it hit him. He missed her. But it was more than that. He needed her. And that terrified him. Lancaster wasn't a man who begged. He wasn't a man who chased after anyone. And yet, here he was, scouring the city, searching for a woman he had once dismissed as just a maid. It took days. But finally, he found her. The sight of her stopped him cold. Amelia stood behind the counter of a small cafe, tying an apron around her waist, laughing softly as she handed a cup of coffee to a customer. She looked happy. For a moment, Lancaster hesitated. What if she didn't want to see him? What if he was too late? But he had already lost her once. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. Amelia stepped outside the cafe to close up for the night when she saw him. Lancaster. Standing under the street lamp, his coat soaked from the drizzle, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What are you doing here? She asked, breathless. Lancaster took a step forward. I was wrong, he said. Amelia's fingers tightened around the door handle. About what? About everything. His voice was raw, unguarded. About you. About me. He let out a shaky breath. I let you walk away because I was afraid. Afraid of what I was feeling. Amelia swallowed hard. And what are you feeling, Lancaster? He didn't hesitate. I love you. The word sent a shockwave through her. Lancaster Sinclair. The man who had once treated her like she was invisible. The man who never let anyone in. He loved her. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Tears burned at the back of her eyes. You hurt me, Lancaster. His expression twisted with regret. I know. He reached for her hand, hesitated, then dropped his arm. But I swear to you, Amelia, I will spend every day proving to you that I see you. That I value you. Not as a maid. Not as someone beneath me. His voice dropped to a whisper. As the woman I love. Amelia's breath hitched. For the first time, she saw Lancaster not as the Heartless Tycoon, but as a man. A man willing to fight for her. A tear slipped down her cheek. And this time, she didn't wipe it away. The Grand Sinclair estate was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. A party, Lancaster Sinclair's signature affair, brimming with the city's most elite. But tonight, there was something different. Tonight, Lancaster had a purpose. Tonight, he was going to show Amelia, and the entire world, exactly where she belonged. By his side, Amelia stood frozen at the entrance of the ballroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had promised herself she wouldn't come. That she wouldn't let Lancaster pull her back into his world. But something inside her needed to know. Needed to see if he meant what he had said. And when she saw him, standing tall in the center of the room, searching the crowd, her breath caught. Then, his gaze locked onto hers. Time stood still. Lancaster strode toward her with unwavering determination, the entire room watching in stunned silence. When he reached her, he took her hand, right there, in front of everyone. Gasps rippled through the guests. He lifted their entwined hands for all to see. This, Lancaster said, his voice strong and unwavering, is Amelia Hart. Murmurs spread across the ballroom. Disbelief. Judgment. Curiosity. She is not just my maid, he continued. She is not someone beneath me. His grip on her hand tightened. She is the woman I love. A stunned hush fell over the crowd. Amelia's breath hitched. He was doing it. He was choosing her, without hesitation. But not everyone was impressed. From the back of the room, Brandon Harrow, the same man who had once humiliated Amelia, let out a cold laugh. Love, he scoffed. Lancaster, let's be honest. Women like her don't belong in our world. Amelia stiffened. Brandon smirked, taking a sip of his whiskey. Tell me, Miss Hart, do you even understand the first thing about business? Or are you just another pretty girl hoping for a free ride? A flicker of pain crossed Amelia's face, but before Lancaster could intervene, she stepped forward. And smiled. Mr. Harrow, she said smoothly, if I recall correctly, Sinclair Enterprises recently suffered a 12% dip in stock due to an overseas investment fallout. Tell me, if you were in charge, how would you restructure the portfolio to stabilize the loss? Brandon faltered. Amelia tilted her head. Or do you just insult people because you have nothing of substance to contribute? A shocked silence. Then, laughter. Not at her. At Brandon. A slow smirk tugged at Lancaster's lips as he watched her completely dismantle the man who had once belittled her. Amelia Hart wasn't just surviving in his world. She was owning it. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by admiration. One by one, guests approached Amelia, not to criticize her, but to congratulate her. To welcome her. To acknowledge her as Lancaster Sinclair's equal. Lancaster leaned in, his voice low against her ear. Dance with me. She turned, searching his face. Are you sure? His gaze softened. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. And as he led her onto the dance floor, spinning her into his arms, Amelia finally let herself believe it. Believe that she wasn't just a maid. She was the woman Lancaster Sinclair loved. And that would never change. The music swirled around them as Lancaster guided Amelia across the dance floor. But for Amelia, the world had narrowed to just one thing. Him. His steady hands, his piercing gaze, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. It felt surreal. Just weeks ago, she had been invisible in this house. Now, she was at the center of it all, because Lancaster Sinclair had chosen her. But even as the warmth of his touch sent shivers down her spine, doubt lingered at the edges of her mind. Because love wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about trust. About believing someone would stay. And she wasn't sure she could trust Lancaster Sinclair with her heart just yet. As the song ended, Lancaster led Amelia out onto the quiet balcony, away from the curious eyes of the guests. The night air was crisp, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Amelia, he murmured, turning to face her. She met his gaze, her hands trembling slightly in his. "This isn't just for show," he said softly. "I meant everything I said in there. I love you." Her breath caught, but she forced herself to speak. "Lancaster, this is all happening so fast." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't want to be a prize you won tonight. I don't want to be someone you have to prove a point with." His expression turned pained. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" she whispered. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I was an arrogant fool. I treated you like you were nothing, when the truth is, you are everything. I didn't see it before, but I do now. And I don't care what anyone else thinks, I just need to know if you feel the same." Amelia swallowed hard. She had spent so long feeling like she didn't belong in his world. But right now, standing here, with him looking at her like she was his entire universe. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe she did belong, because she had built herself into a woman strong enough to stand beside him. "I care about you, Lancaster," she admitted finally. "But love isn't just words. I need time to see if you mean this." His grip on her hand tightened, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Then I'll prove it to you." She searched his face. "How?" "By waiting," he said. "By showing you every single day that I'm not going anywhere." Amelia's heart clenched. Because for the first time, she truly believed him. The party had ended. The guests had left. But the night was far from over. As Lancaster walked Amelia to the car waiting to take her back to the small cafe where she now worked, he hesitated. "I don't want you to leave," he admitted. She smiled softly. "And I don't want to leave angry or confused. But I need time, Lancaster." He nodded. "Then take all the time you need." She glanced up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. No arguments. No demands. Just understanding. And in that moment, Amelia realized something. Lancaster Sinclair wasn't just changing for her. He was changing because of her. Because when you truly love someone, you let them choose you in their own time. As the car pulled away, Lancaster stood on the driveway, watching her disappear into the night. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of waiting. Because Amelia Hart was worth it. And one day, she would realize he was worth it too. 1 year later. The sun cast a golden glow over the city as Amelia stepped into the bustling cafe she now owned. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the sound of soft chatter and clinking cups. Her cafe. Her dream. And she had built it with her own hands. She smiled as she adjusted the apron around her waist, watching as customers filled the space, sipping their drinks, laughing, and sharing stories. It was everything she had ever wanted. But there was still one thing missing. Or rather, one person. The door chimed. Amelia turned, her heart skipping a beat. Lancaster Sinclair stood in the doorway, dressed in a crisp suit, his sharp features softened by a smile that was meant only for her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he took slow, deliberate steps toward her. "You did it," he murmured, glancing around the cafe. "It's beautiful." Amelia crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "And here I thought billionaires only drank overpriced espresso in skyscraper offices." His lips twitched. "I've acquired a new taste for small, independent cafes." "Is that so?" she teased. Lancaster exhaled, his playful expression turning serious. "Amelia, I meant what I said that night. I've spent the last year proving it, not just to you, but to myself. I didn't chase after you. I didn't try to force you into my world. Instead, I learned how to live in yours." Her breath hitched. Because he had. Over the past year, he had quietly supported her from a distance. Investing in her business without controlling it. Encouraging her ambitions without overshadowing them. He had changed. And she had grown. Now, they stood as equals. "Have you forgiven me?" he asked softly. Amelia steadied him, the man who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a servant. And now, he stood before her, offering not just his love, but his respect. "Yes," she whispered. "I forgave you a long time ago." Relief flickered in his eyes. "Then I have just one more question." She tilted her head. "What?" Lancaster reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Amelia's breath caught as he sank onto one knee, right there in the middle of her cafe, in front of customers and employees alike. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. "Amelia Hart," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You taught me how to love. You showed me what it means to truly care about someone. And I can't imagine my life without you in it." He opened the box, revealing a delicate diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. She had spent so much of her life believing she wasn't worthy of this kind of love. But Lancaster had waited. He had fought for her, not with grand gestures, but with quiet patience. And now, he was asking her to be his, not as a possession, not as someone beneath him, but as his equal. Amelia inhaled sharply. Then, with a trembling smile, she whispered, "Yes." The cafe erupted in cheers. Lancaster slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood, cupping her face as he kissed her, slow, deep, filled with everything they had been through. And in that moment, Amelia knew. This was just the beginning. A few months later, the world watched as the cold, ruthless billionaire Lancaster Sinclair married the woman who had once been his maid. The tabloids called it the most scandalous love story of the decade. But to them, it was simply love. Love that had been tested. Love that had grown. Love that had proven it didn't matter where you came from. Only where you were going. Together.